Welcome to today's program, and we're going over to Liverpool, England, a place where my parents were from, and we have standing by someone who is quite well known. In fact, he was a member of the Beatles. Go ahead, dear friend, and introduce our special guest.
Yeah, this is John Lennon of the Fab Four telling you about a fab friend named Skip. He's written a new book. It's called Defying Normal, which is something I've always been a part of doing, from the very beginning. Take it away, Skip.
Well, that was great. Well, we have to let you into a secret. That actually was Skip Heitzig doing his famous John Lennon impersonation. We wish we could have had John Lennon on, but certainly both you and John have always defied the normal, and the book you've just written is called Defying Normal, Soaring Above the Status Quo. Tell us a little bit about the book and how you define normal, Skip.
Yeah, I love, first of all, the fact that you say status quo instead of status quo.
Yeah, well, that's the correct way.
I'm sure it is. You invented language. Who am I to say otherwise? So, anyway, thank you, Dan, for having me on here. The book Defying Normal is really about the thought of not settling for life without significance. And that's how I define status quo. Status quo is simply a Latin phrase that means the state in which, or the current state of affairs, or the way things are. And we've all heard people say, well, that's just the way things are. And I believe that God wants us to live above that, to soar above that, and not to be what Paul said is, don't be conformed to this world, but transformed by the renewing of your mind.
So if John Lennon was actually listening to this, and we wish he could, what would you say to him about his own life, and how he could have really had such an influence on the world?
I would say, John, first of all, I love your whole countercultural ideal. However, Christianity is the ultimate counterculture. And if you want to really stand out, then you take up the cause of Christ and be on his side, because he stood against his culture, his religious culture, and he wasn't a bad citizen. He paid his taxes and such, but the point is that Jesus lived a unique life, as did Daniel the prophet, that this book that I've written is really based upon, and he managed to live a life of balance. Sort of balancing gracious compliance and courageous nonconformity together. That's a tough place to be, but he did it. He did it so well. Because of that, he influenced not one, not two, not three, but 4 world governing powers, 4 kings in a row, from Nebuchadnezzar all the way to Cyrus. A total of 70 years he influenced those cultures. And I contend influences people today.
Wow. Well, Skip, tell us a little bit, how do you define normal? We hear people say a lot, I live a normal sort of life, but how would you define normal?
Okay. First of all, I would think the normal life is the way normal people live a normal life is they want to blend in, and they will reflect the values of their culture, the temperature of their culture. And I would call that, in technical terms, a thermometer. A thermometer is something that simply reads what's going on around it. So if it's warm, it goes up. If it's cold, it goes down. That's a thermometer. A thermostat, on the other hand, is something that sets what the temperature ought to be. And a person who lives as a thermostat rather than a thermometer is somebody who has made a deliberate course correction and decides to live a life that not only is different from everybody else's, but is attractive in that difference. And by their words and by their life, they will influence people around them to want to be like that. That is really what it means in a nutshell to define normal. Now, I understand, Dan, that everybody has difficult things that happen, so that sounds very idealistic. But, one of the things I say in this book is when the waves of life come crashing down, go surfing. Learn how to take the circumstances of your life that are difficult and ride that wave and let that be an opportunity. Daniel had everything going against him, not for him. He was a Middle Eastern refugee in Iraq right? He was taken from Jerusalem to Babylon at age 15 to 17, a young teenager. So he was separated from family and friends, from his environment. He had a hostile political environment around him in Babylon. He had pagan religious system around him. He had colleagues who were out to get him. And not only did he survive that, but he thrived in it. And not only did he thrive in it, but he brought life to others in it. So it's a very remarkable story.
Well, my real name is Daniel, so it's wonderful to hear this. You compare Daniel to Jesus. How are they really similar, Skip?
Well, Jesus himself was countercultural. He wasn't a lawbreaker. He said, I didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law. So, he said something interesting that was so in balance of I'm defying normal, but I'm going to comply with the culture. When he took money to pay the taxes that were due, and he said, whose face is on this coin? And they said, Caesar. And then Jesus said, well, then give to Caesar what belongs to him, but give to God the things that belong to God. And, that's setting your stake in the ground. That's a very countercultural statement to make. In other words, we give the government what is due the government, but there are certain things not due the government that are only due God. Let's not forget that component. So that's one way. Then number two, Daniel was found blameless. It says in Daniel 6 that no charge could be leveled against him. And Jesus also, when he stood before Pilate, he said, I find no fault in him at all. So we have that going for him. And then there's Daniel's prayer life. Daniel prayed 3 times a day. Jesus prayed 3 times in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I'd sum it up by just saying both Daniel and Jesus lived extraordinarily exemplary lives. And, Daniel chapter 6, in a chapter in my book called A Hill Worth Dying On, Daniel knew that he could follow the king's edicts and commands and go along with the government up to a certain extent. And then at that extent, he sort of threw caution to the wind. He activated his faith in God, and he did that because he'd already abandoned his life to God. And so, he just said, if this is the hill I'm going to die on, this is the hill I'm going to die on.
Wow. Well, many years ago, before I became totally respectable, Skip, I worked for the tabloids and also the National Enquirer. And I found that the only way to succeed, to be normal, as it were, in that pretty bizarre world, was to go along and do the things the other reporters did, where you would lie, steal and cheat. And for quite a while, I basically lost my faith and went along the normal path for a tabloid journalist, and then finally came back to the Lord and had to walk away from it. But, this is very difficult for many people. They're in a business, they're in a job where they're expected to do things that maybe are immoral, or, it's the only way they're going to succeed. What advice would you give to someone who is caught in a profession that really is going to be a problem? They may lose their job if they defy the normal, and go ahead and follow their faith.
Well, let me just go back to Daniel for a moment. Daniel was a man of integrity. He had integrity in his personal life. He had integrity in his professional life. He had integrity when he was under fire and scrutiny by other people. And then he had integrity in his spiritual life. So all of that was in balance. And it was so amazing that he could be a man of such conviction, and yet people would notice that he is better and wiser than the people around him, and he always got promoted. And one of the best things I would say to people who are just in the day-to-day workforce is be the best possible worker that your boss or system or company president or CEO can rely on. Years ago, I was getting a job, or I wanted to get a job at Westminster Community Hospital in Orange County. And I walked in. I was one of many applicants in the radiology department. And I gave them my resume, and I had an interview. And the head of the department said, well, thank you very much. We appreciate you coming in. We'll let you know. Now, I know a blow-off when I hear one. And you just, yeah, whatever. This is like next. I'm never going to hear from him again. So I left the room, and I walked down the hallway. And something got a hold of me and told me to go back. So I went back into the office, knocked on the door. It was open, and I said, excuse me, I know you just interviewed me. But I want to just tell you one final thing before I leave, and that is this. If you hire me, you will have hired the best worker you could hire in this department. I will do better than anyone you have working for you now. I will be reliable. I will be on time, and you'll like the kind of work that I produce. And he looked at me and he said, you got the job, just like that. Now, having said that, I knew I had to produce, right? You just don't make a promise like that and be like a politician one term down the line going back on your word. So I knew that I had to kind of kick it in high gear and prove myself. But I just thought that's what Daniel did. That's what he lived like. He was affable. He was reliable. People loved being around him. And God gave him favor. You know, that was the added bonus, is that not only did people give him favor, but God gave him favor. And so that he incurred the jealousy and the wrath of his other coworkers, his colleagues later on. But when we can live that way, I'm living for the glory of God. I don't want to settle for mundane. I don't want to settle for blending in. I want to stand out, but I don't want to stand out in an odd way. I want to stand out in a God way.
Skipper, how do we avoid being obnoxious to people? You know, when you first become a believer, you're on fire and you're pointing your finger at people and you think you're witnessing for the Lord, and yet they're taking great offense. Is there a way of, you know, when you first come to Christ, you learn to present it in a winsome way rather than an obnoxious way?
Yeah, that's a great point, Dan. I think we start out obnoxious, and simply because we have zeal and we don't have knowledge. And as we walk a little bit longer, a little bit further, then, you know, the sharp edges of life hone us a little bit. And, you know, I started out with my parents and my friends as a junior John the Baptist. I wanted to make sure that before sundown they were on their knees repenting. And, you know, that was a little bit too hard for them. And I think why? Because they wanted to see if it really was a reality in my life. You know, once you say that you're a believer in Christ, you're sort of not just in the bullseye, but you're in the spotlight. It's like you're telling people, examine my life a little bit closer and a little bit more carefully. And you're giving that invitation for people to scrutinize you. So when you say you're a believer, you have to live in such a way that you're attracting them to Christ. Kind of going off what I just mentioned to you a minute ago, when I was working at a different hospital in Orange County, California, I was in the radiology department, and I asked an orderly to go get a patient for me on, I think, the third floor. Well, he didn't come down for a long time. It was like 30-minute delay, and I needed the patient in and out. And he said, well, I didn't come down on time because I was witnessing to this other patient and telling him about the Lord. And I drew him aside later on, and I said, listen, I appreciate your zeal. I appreciate your wanting to win people to Christ. You have my heart on that. You have my support. But do it on your own time. Don't do it on our time. Do it at lunchtime. Do it after work. Go up and witness to these people. But when you're asked to get somebody, get them. Do it promptly. Be the best worker. If you want to give a good witness here, be the best worker where everyone knows they can rely on you.
Yeah, I remember just after I became a Christian, I was so intent in winning the whole office to the Lord that one guy took offense, suddenly ran over to my desk and ripped my shirt off and threw it on the floor and yelled at me. And I thought that was wonderful. I was being persecuted for my faith. But looking back now, I'm not quite sure whether I was being persecuted for my faith or whether I was just acting as a bit of an idiot. And, of course, that can happen quite regularly. We know it all in the early days, but as we get older, did Daniel ever exhibit a time where he was a bit arrogant?
Well, we don't read of that. You know, there's two people in the Bible, aside from the Lord Jesus Christ, but two people in the Bible of which nothing negative is said. And one of them is Daniel, and the other is Joseph in the Old Testament. So that in and of itself is it's irregular, because the Bible's very forthcoming about the faults of all its heroes. And yet Daniel seemed to have the ability to go through life from a teenager to an old man. That's where we leave off in the book of Daniel. He has survived 70 years of captivity. and we read of no glaring irregularities. I wouldn't say arrogance. I would say a better word for it would be confidence. Right? He is confident in God, and he activated his confidence in God. It wasn't just, I believe God can do it. Daniel was the kind of guy who said, God will do it, and if he doesn't do it, I'm dead. Like he went in chapter 2 to the king, and he goes, don't be so hasty. None of these other guys can tell you what you dreamed. I'll tell you what it was, and I'll tell you what it means. But I will do it. And then he went and he prayed, right? So that tells me is that you have a guy who doesn't just say God can do anything. He wants to. It's a guy who says God will do something. When I am standing in front of you, this is going to happen. And if he doesn't, I'm a dead man.
The book's broken down into 8 characteristics of Daniel that he embodies. Tell us some of those and why you like those particular ones.
What I did, Dan, as you know, the book of Daniel has a prophetic element as well as a personal element. It's almost like you're looking at 2 books. The first part of Daniel is his personal life, and it's really his story. And the second half of the book is organized that shows the dreams, the visions, the prophetic utterances, some of them quite detailed. And it's a fabulous book. It's called The Backbone of Prophecy by many prophecy buffs. But what I've done is kind of limit it to the personality of Daniel and the character of Daniel. So what I did is I went through, and I didn't know how many there would be. I just said, I want to find out what elements in Daniel's life are noteworthy, and what are the things that really made him different and helped him rise above what was going on around him in his culture, the pressures of his culture, the values of his culture, and how he was able to soar above that and to defy that. So I begin in chapter 1 called Conquering Your Inner Space, and it's about self-control, that Daniel, from a young age, purposed in his heart not to defile himself. So with all the pressure on Daniel's life, there was sufficient pressure inside of Daniel to counteract the pressure outside of Daniel. So that's where it all begins. And I have to just underline and underscore that the rest of Daniel's life from that period onward depends on the decision he makes in his heart. If he doesn't make the right decision, he will not have the influence that he had. If he makes the right decision, he will have a life of fruitfulness and effectiveness. And he did. So that's chapter 1, Conquering Your Inner Space. Then in chapter 2, I talk about active faith. It's called risk or no reward. So Daniel is the kind of a kid who put his faith in the Lord and put his life on the line. He got out of a comfort zone. And we all love comfort zones. They're comfortable, right? We have our routines. We have our ways of doing things. And we say, well, I'm just that way. Or, I'm reserved because I'm British. Or I'm hot-tempered because I'm Latino. Or we all have our little shtick. But I think God wants to stretch us and grow us out a little bit. So I talk about how Daniel activated his faith. And so there's 8 chapters of those different characteristics.
What was the favorite one for you?
Oh, that's hard. Perhaps there's a couple of them, but in my 4th chapter of Defying Normal, I have a chapter called Find a Hill Worth Dying On, and it's about his personal integrity, and it's about his private life. And Daniel did what Daniel always has done, but he knew the law had been passed. He knew that the government was against him. He knew that that he would probably die if he would go and pray. But it says Daniel did what he always had done, and he prayed 3 times a day facing Jerusalem. And so that's kind of his hill worth dying on. Oswald Chambers once said, "My worth to God in public is what I am in private." And I think Daniel lived by that moniker, that he in private and in public, he was the same guy.
You've got in the book about how Daniel purposed in his heart to do God's will. What does that mean exactly?
Well, I contend that courage is always an inside job. And there was an inner determination in Daniel. when your decisions become your convictions, that's where courage is developed. So it says Daniel purposed in his heart, or literally he placed upon his heart. That is, Daniel made a decision, and then he placed that decision on his heart. That became the template for the rest of his life. And the effectiveness, as I said, of the rest of his life depends on that decision in that moment. It's sort of like a farmer. A farmer reaps in the fall what he plants and plows in the spring. So what Daniel does in that moment of crisis is going to define him for the rest of his life. Isn't it interesting, Dan, that some of our most significant choices in life are made when we're young? Who our friends are going to be, what we're going to major in, and what our career is going to be, who we're going to marry. And so Daniel is setting that upon his heart. And I'll tell you why that's the most important. I think it's the most important chapter of the book, chapter 1 of Daniel, is that when you purpose in your heart like Daniel did, the idea is that you are creating a counter pressure. We all talk about the pressure of the world, peer pressure, the pressure to conform, but you can make it through if you have enough pressure on the inside. And I use the example of a scuba diver. A scuba diver, we can't go in the ocean and survive, not only because we can't breathe through gills, we need, air to go into our lungs, but we also will encounter pressure in the ocean. The deeper we go, the diver has to go through a process of compression and decompression so as not to get nitrogen narcosis. And you can only go down, they say, to about 250 feet. Rarely do you go deeper than that, and you do it for a short period of time. However, there are certain species of fish in the ocean that can go down to thousands of feet. And submarines can get crushed at a certain depth. So how is it these little thin-skinned fishies can manage? And the answer is they have enough pressure on the inside of them to counteract the pressure that's coming from the outside. So that's the way it is in our lives. Decisions of the heart form convictions of the life, and that produces the counter pressure to survive this culture.
What do you think that Daniel would make of what's going on in his part of the world today, with ISIS and the awful violence that's going on? Do you think he would be horrified, or was it pretty bad even during his days?
I think it was bad during his days. They didn't have CNN or Fox News to broadcast live images of what was happening, or beheadings like we see in northern Africa, Libya, etc. But if you think of the history of the Ninevites or the Babylonians, it wasn't that different. If we were to be able to see a live CNN feed in 586 B.C. of the Babylonians butchering Jewish people in the streets of Jerusalem, taking and chaining captives and bringing them away as slaves to a foreign land, burning the city down to the ground, it would be a shocking image that would send shockwaves throughout the world. So it's always been a violent part of the world, and Daniel would look at that and say, "Yeah, I went through that. I just sure. I don't want to minimize what ISIS is doing, because." If you don't conform, if you don't pay the tax, if you don't convert, you will die. Daniel, of course, was willing to do that, and we have brothers and sisters around this globe who are fearlessly living in Daniel's shoes and are dying for their faith, and we should be aware of that. We should be supporting them. I think Daniel these would be familiar images to him.
I wanted to bring John Lennon back in just to talk a little bit about the book. John, could you tell listeners how they can get a copy of Skip Heitzig's book?
Well, I'd be delighted to, actually, Dan. When I was with Apple Records, we had a distribution deal. And if you wanted to get one of our records, you had to get it through Apple or through Capitol. We had a representative here. But, you can get Skip's book through Amazon now, Amazon.com. Or you can go right to Barnes & Nobles. They have it in your local store usually, or order it there. Or you can go to ChristianBook.com, I wasn't knocking it or putting it down. I was just saying it.
So would you buy the book yourself, John?
I have the book right here,
So are you going to be more normal in future?
Oh, who are you talking to?
I'm talking to John Lennon.
Oh, well, let me speak on behalf of John for just a moment, because I wish that John Lennon could have heard the revolutionary message of Jesus Christ, not some of the pablum that was given to him or the marginalization of Christianity that was given to him that was so allowed. First of all, when you have a church that's supported by the state, you've got problems built in, and he came from that system. He was asked to play outside the church, and I've been to the church where he met Paul McCartney, and there's a plaque on the outside, and boy, when I see that, I wish there'd be a plaque inside the church, rather than outside. And these guys were pushed out. And I've often thought if Chuck Smith could have been John Lennon's pastor, things may have been much different, because he would have probably had John do a main service inside the church.
Well, that's so interesting. We've been speaking with John Lennon, alias Skip Heitzig. His new book is called Defying Normal, and as you know, we've been told where to get it. I wanted to thank you, Skip, so much for being on the program.
Dan, thank you, and it's great to talk to you again.